We're going to call this piece Identification of Problems, Needs, and Opportunities Facing Refuges and the LCCs. And so before we kick it out to the audience and kind of get your ideas on that, I'm going to present you with some ideas that I've gleaned from various folks from the refuge system, their insights and observations on how to better collaborate between refuges and LCCs. And then we'll get to you. And we hope to set aside a fair amount of the workshop time, not for you just to sit and listen, but to actually engage the audience and hear from you as well. And with that, I will give you Doug Austen, National LCC Coordinator.
Thanks, Bridgette. First of all, the U.S. won soccer game 3-1 over France, so they're in the finals. Yay. My wife came along with me. She's watching the game, and I was so disappointed I couldn't be there with her because we're big into soccer fans since both our kids play soccer a lot, so it's good to see. Before I get going, we do have a number of LCC people here with us, or people related to that. And I want to point them out because we're not going to cover near as much as we want to about LCCs here, and I know you'll have questions and comments afterwards, and I want you to feel free to track these folks down and engage in conversations with them about LCCs as well. So I'm going to try to point them out. I can see some. Joel Reynolds is over here. Yep, and our newest LCC member, you can stand up, introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Tim Brown. I'm the new basic contact coordinator for Mr. Florida LCC.
And Tim is in this fascinating position where he works for Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, part-time, or half funded with them, and half funded by Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's a joint position between them, hosted with Florida as well. So it really encapsulates part of the model of what the LCCs really try to do, which is engage partners in a very intimate and real way. I mentioned Joel Reynolds. Joel's with Alaska, up with one of the LCCs there, the science coordinator. And Rob Campoloni, right next to him. Rob is working partly with us now as well, but he's actually a refuge person. Rob, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Rob Campoloni, I'm in the Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System in Arlington, Virginia. I'm the national level liaison to the LCC, so I'm working very closely with Doug and Seth Mott over in the office.
Thanks, Rob. Right behind Rob, we have 3 of our ARDs for science applications, and I'll just let them stand up and introduce themselves really quickly as well.
My name is Richard Leopold. I'm the ARD for Science Applications in Region 3 of Minneapolis.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dana Roth. I'm the ARD for Science Applications at Ballroom. Hi, everybody. Cindy Jacobson, ARD for Science Applications in Alaska, Anchorage.
Okay, I thought I saw Craig Sarnecki in here somewhere. Is he?
What's his name?
Yeah. And
Craig Sarnecki, of the Midwest and Great Lakes LCC coordinator. Thanks.
great. John?
John Turpak, Science Coordinator for the Gulf Coast Plains and Ozarks LCC, Vicksburg, Mississippi.
And I know Bill Uline is here. Is he in the room? No, Bill Uline's one of the ARDs as well out of Region 4. So keep these folks in mind as you think about the LCCs, and we really want to get your feedback about what your reflections are, ideas. We only have an hour and a half here this afternoon, and there's a lot more information that I think can be conveyed as well as received from you all. So take advantage of that, and we'll listen and hear and try to understand and do what we can to address issues, concerns that you all have. So my job here is to just get things set up, really to pass the baton on to Andrew and Bridgette, who are going to talk a lot more in detail about what's going on within particular LCCs and refuges. And that'll lead, as Bridgette said, into what we hope is a very rich conversation about this. But in general, LCCs are based upon, like everything else we do, on the shoulders of a lot of fascinating and important work behind us. And really, this is a historic landscape, and really what you are as a part of this whole process is the refuge system, the forests, and the national parks, and what they've done in terms of preserving, protecting, restoring this incredible treasure of landscapes throughout the U.S. And I do apologize to the Alaskan folks here. It's not on this map. I know they'll probably take me to task about that, but I borrowed this slide from somebody else. It was a very nice presentation of this. So accept those apologies up front. But recognizing that we're going into a changing times, and not that CHAMs haven't been changing in the past, they always have been, but we're seeing some changes now. They're just phenomenal. They're pervasive in scope, and they're things that we just don't know quite how to deal with them. We're dealing with a lot of changes, of course, with climate, amongst many other things, but also, and LCCs deal with all these things in terms of habitat fragmentation, genetic isolation, invasive species, something that we've been dealing with for many, many years. Water scarcity, increasingly so, even in parts of the country that haven't had that problem in the past. Energy development, I live in Pennsylvania, Marcellus Shale is impacting the state in ways that we just can't even understand right now. It'll have impacts just like timber and coal has over the past 150 years. Decreasing budgets, we've seen that recently in terms of the table being set for a very difficult FY12 and 13 budgets coming on after that, and many other issues. All compounded, obviously, by rapidly changing climate in a setting that we really don't fully understand, but we know things are happening. We're seeing them. People are living through those processes. It's changing people's lives right now. So how do we deal with this? We have to recognize that this is going to have a lot of big impacts on us. This is some projections that Jean Brennan, our Appalachian LCC coordinator, provided and uses in one of her presentations, showing the change in the number of days or weeks where we have temperatures over 100 degrees over the course of the next 80 or so years. And look at the lessening number of white, or amount of white on these maps over time. And this is going to have traumatic effects in terms of biome shifts, weather events, asynchronicity of events that will all trigger problems that we're seeing across the landscape. It fundamentally changes how we look at these protected areas. And we've been working a lot with the Park Service, for example, and they're fundamentally asking the question of the value of these parks in this changing landscape, and how does one address those sorts of things? Very, very challenging issues for all of us that we're going to have to struggle with over the years ahead. What does this mean? A new reality is coming upon us, one that is dynamic. This whole issue of stability doesn't exist anymore. It's going to make things very complicated and changing environment for us that we'll have to figure out how to deal with new tools, new methodologies, and new approaches. In the Pacific Islands, there's some wonderful presentations yesterday by the Refuge manager that deals with those and identifies some of these things that our LCCs are addressing as well, in terms of dramatic changes in sea level rise that are differential across different parts of the ocean, impacting whole island nations and the future of those nations to exist, which is something that most of us can't even fathom, is the fact that we might not even have the place where we're born in still existing 100 years from now. Ocean warming, decreasing rain, ambient temperature changes, salinity, acidification, those sorts of things, all having dramatic effects that we need to figure out how to address. This all was then translated into what Secretary Salazar did in his Secretarial Order 3289, which established these LCCs as a DOI entity, raised the level of issues we have to address, not only the fish and wildlife resources, but cultural resources as well, and all the things related to that. Brought into bear the role of the climate science centers, and I'll mention those just a little bit here. It'd be very good for us, I think, to spend some time down the line here helping you all understand how the climate science centers and the LCCs will work together better over time to address these issues collectively, a very important partnership. But it really points out this issue of working together across these lines amongst federal, state, tribes, and local governments. My background is as a state person, 26 years with Illinois and Pennsylvania, and recognizing in those roles that the states need partners as much as the feds need partners with the states. I think the phrase was used a number of times before that there should be no light between the two, and that's really true, as well as the NGOs who bring a tremendous wealth of science. Increasing just in my career, the value that the NGOs bring to this table is phenomenal. And to not take advantage of that ability would be a huge remiss on our part. So what do the LCCs do? Just a real short run-through of the LCCs. They are applied conservation science partnerships. This is recognizing that many of you probably are already involved in LCCs and have a personal understanding of them. Some of you may not be or may have heard about them and simply are trying to build an understanding and figure out how you might interact with them over time. So this conservation science partnership brings to bear these various entities in a way that collectively can help bring their assets to the table, building capacity in a way that we haven't done before, recognizing that none of us have the capacity to challenge these new stresses in and of ourselves. These are units of planning and adaptive science. There's sessions about adaptive management. That's part of the plan. I think it's recommendation number 6. There's a session this morning on that. How does one deal with the needs for science to help illustrate and inform the planning processes that we need to do to better position our refuges and the lands around them in the landscape context to address these changes? and this is a national and international network. The LCCs incorporate large parts of Canada and Mexico, and there's a lot of work going on right now with those governments to engage them, and in many cases, they're coming to us and asking to be involved and finding a tremendous benefit from this. So there are obvious partners with this whole process, just as the other states in the U.S., the continental U.S., and others are. So we have the map. The one part of the map that's not on here is a partnership that has just been recently identified in the Caribbean, which is being led by the U.S. Forest Service. The International Institute of Tropical Forestry is taking the leadership on that, along with Fish and Wildlife Service and a number of other agencies. So we have 22 LCCs that are now moving along and becoming quite active, and I'll give you a little bit of background on that in a second here. I wanted to mention the climate science centers, and more or less in passing to give you an understanding of how these work together in a very brief way. We don't have time to get into this too much, but the relationship between those two is important, and it's evolving right now because the climate science centers are just getting themselves going. There's 8 of these climate science centers that have been identified, and this is the map that they use. Is basically, I think, predicated on old USGS regions. They don't match up with the LCCs, as you can tell. But what we've tried to do is really create a many-to-one relationship. Several LCCs relate to a CSC. And there's staffing relationships between the two, where we sit on their oversight boards, in a sense, and they sit on ours to make sure that we have that connection. 5 of these CSCs have been identified. The Alaska, the Northwest, the Southwest, the North Central, and the Southeast. In some cases, those are for example, in the Southeast, it's on the campus of North Carolina State University, where we also have the LCC, which is housed within the North Carolina Wild Resources Commission. There's also a cooperative fish and wildlife research unit on the campus. So there's a variety of entities all co-located that makes for a very nice nexus of work to address these challenges collectively. They're not all set up quite that way, but where possible, these are being located where they can take advantage of the other entities on their staff. So to try to illustrate the relationship between all this stuff and bring in the climate science of this, and build upon this fundamental background of the strategic habitat conservation process. This is something that you're all familiar with. The LCCs provide this adaptive landscape scale approach. The climate science centers provide, amongst many other entities that provide science, a lot of the information that help drive this process. One feeds into the other. The LCCs are defined as a primary customer of the climate science centers. There's that relationship between the two. So if you think about this as a spectrum of science, and you think about some of the broadest science out there, the global climate models, for example, that come out of IPCC, those are generally done by research institutions, groups like NOAA, entities that have a capacity and a focus on that level of information. That's beyond what the climate science centers and the LCCs do, but that's a critical part of creating the foundation of this knowledge base. Where that transitions, though, into is where the climate science centers take that information and using the guidance they're given from the LCC, say, what do we do with this information? How do we translate this into information that can guide our natural resources conservation work? Ecosystem response models and forecasting, regional habitat population models, downscale climate models, the kind of things that really can be used by our managers then to say, where do we do our work? What's the impact we're seeing down the line? How do we see sea level rise, or whatever the case might be in terms of information that we can use for our management actions. Then the LCCs play into this in terms of taking that information, relaying that to our partners, the states, the other federal agencies, our own internal uses, and saying, here's how this can be used to solve your problems. Now, there's a whole series of scale issues with this and other things, but there's a relationship between all these pieces that allow this information to flow both down this pipeline and back up. Downward in terms of transferring this information to people who can use it. Upwards in the fact that we need to tell them what we need to do. We need to tell them what our problems are. We need to know we need to tell them what information we need to do to solve those problems and tee up the questions that are most important for them to address in their research. So where are we at with the LCCs right now? Just a real quick status on this. Of the 22 LCCs, 9 of them, actually 10 of them now, have both coordinators and science coordinators in place. 3 of them are actually led by other entities within Department of Interior. Bureau of Land Management manages the Great Basin LCC, which is out there primarily in Nevada. Bureau of Reclamation manages the South Atlantic and the Desert LCC. In both of those cases, we have Fish and Wildlife Service staff that co-work with them. In most cases, the science coordinators work with them. For example, in the Desert LCC, Christina Voigt is the science coordinator, and BOR is hiring an LCC coordinator for that LCC. So there's multiple staffings in these LCCs. 5 of the LCCs have coordinators only right now. Hopefully by the end of 2011, we'll have all 21 or 22 LCCs, probably 21 of them staffed with LCC coordinators in place. And then a number of LCCs have staff from other agencies as well. For example, the Great Northern LCC, that one that extends from British and Columbia, Alberta, down through Idaho into western Wyoming, that has staffing that's co-led by both National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service as the LCC coordinators and science coordinators from both the USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service. So there's 3 different agencies all staffing that LCC. Park Service, for example, is another phenomenal partner. What they've done is they've hired 6 staff specifically focused on LCCs. One of them, for example, is a cultural resources specialist, Stanton Nanamoto, who works out in Hawaii, native Hawaiian, who's training and experiences in how to take what we're seeing in terms of environmental changes and translate that into cultural effects. One of them is an urban parks person working in DC who will work nationwide, and the others are housed with staff either with LCCs or in conjunction with them. And they've identified key contacts for all 21 and soon to be 22 LCCs as well. So they're engaged at a very intimate level, both in terms of full-time staffing and in terms of contacts with all the LCCs. Increasingly, other agencies are doing the same thing. For example, Forest Service has a list of LCC staff that they work with and a liaison with between the Forest Service and the LCCs. So we're building those linkages to try to take advantage of the capacities they have, but also engage them and the programs that they have into solving the issues that the LCCs identify. So with that, what I want to do is just sort of turn this over to Andrew, who's going to go into a lot more detail about specific examples of where LCCs and refuges, in particular, have been interacting to identify and complete some really phenomenal work.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Bridgette, for the introduction, and Doug for the overview. I also want to give my thanks to Rick Nelson, who provided so much of the information for this, and wish him well as he watches the floodwaters of the Missouri River go by his house. So I think we all wish him well in that. So my piece of this workshop is to talk to you a little bit more specifically about some projects that LCCs are working on that should both help support refuge decision-making and also are a real opportunity to show how refuges and LCCs can and should be working together. But before I do that, I wanted to just make a few key points building on the introduction that Doug gave about the relationship between LCCs and national wildlife refuges. And one of those is just to remind you that LCCs are self-directed partnerships that include federal and state agencies, NGOs, universities, tribes, and that the service is part of this self-directed partnership, and that these self-directed partnerships are developing a shared science capacity to address the common goals that they've identified. The second point is that the role of the Department of the Interior bureaus, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, is not only as a partner at that table, but as facilitators of these partnerships. And part of that point is that although Fish and Wildlife Service staff are serving as staff to these LCCs in many places, these are not service programs. These are self-directed partnerships that the service is facilitating. One of the key partners, and this has certainly resonated with me a lot over the last couple days, one of the real key partners in landscapes in which all the LCCs work, of course, is National Wildlife Refuges. The presence of conservation lands and the expertise and the leadership and the local knowledge really make refuges leaders within those landscapes and critical partners within the LCC partnerships, really foundational partners within the LCC partnerships. So it's a relationship that we really need to develop fully. And the final point I'll make as I start to talk about projects is that the LCC projects I'm going to talk about, as well as the other LCC projects that are going on, are really developed as part of this shared science capacity that's helped. It's really intended to help the partnership and the partners that are part of that partnership do their work of defining, designing, and delivering conservation in these landscapes to sustain natural resources. So as we think about specific projects that are working in conjunction with refuges or benefiting refuges, think about them as really part of this shared science capacity that's developed for the partnership. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects from 4 different LCCs across the country, starting with the Arctic LCC, then the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC, then the California LCC, and then the North Atlantic LCC. As Doug showed through his introductions earlier, we also have probably another 4 or 5 LCCs represented here in the room, so that when we get to the discussion point, hopefully we can bring in other LCC projects that are relevant to the discussions. So I'm going to start at the top of the continent in the Arctic LCC, clearly an LCC that is probably experiencing some of the most immediate and most dramatic impacts of climate change. And I'll just mention, for each of these, I am providing both the coordinator, science coordinator, and web link if you want to know more about these projects. I am going to really just touch on them to give you a flavor for the projects to help facilitate our discussion. So this dramatic impact of climate change is exemplified in the Arctic LCC by this comparison of images of the McCall Glacier from 1958 and 2003. And this is actually the first issue that is being addressed by an LCC project here, which is the need for a long-term monitoring of the impacts of climate change on these glaciers, including the impact in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so the problem here is that that glacial meltwater is critical as a source of water for the rivers, and therefore is critical to supporting the subsistence fisheries, including the Dolly Varden fisheries in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and adjacent areas. So clearly, with the alpine glaciers melting, there's a need for an increased understanding of how much water in those rivers is based on this glacial meltwater, and based on that understanding, trying to understand what it's going to take to sustain these fisheries over time and the other impacts of the loss of that glacial meltwater, including the estuarine impacts that will affect all the migratory birds. So this is an example of a project where some of the work is being done on a refuge, some of the information to support this is coming from a refuge, and the decision support is going to help refuge managers make good decisions about how to adapt to these changes. The coastal part of the Arctic LCC has or is going to experience dramatic impacts, and you can just see what those impacts are from this diagram. And part of the issue here is there's a whole complex set of impacts that's expected, and trying to understand that and make decisions in response to those many changes is really the challenge that's presented through this second project, which is to model the Barrier Island Lagoon system response to projected Arctic warming. And by really trying to model and understand these impacts to provide decision makers information they need to make good decisions to adapt to these changes. This is an example of a project that's being piloted on a refuge, in this case the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, that can be then extrapolated out to a larger area. Now going to the heart of the continent, to the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC, obviously an area that's seen dramatic impacts from agriculture, but an area that's very sensitive to changes in both temperature and precipitation. And so that's a really important part of the work that's being done through the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC. And the first project actually addresses climate impacts to wetlands and the wetland-dependent birds in the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC. And the issue is that the current models and predictions are not at a precision that allows managers both in the refuge and wetland management districts and surrounding areas to make decisions about likely future impacts and how they should prioritize their work. So the outcomes of this project are to provide better downscaled climate models, and then relate those to habitat impacts and ultimately to species using those habitats through niche models. And just as importantly, I think, is to try to understand the uncertainty that's associated with these climate models. I don't think the climate models predicted what's going on in the plains and prairie potholes this year, for example. So really trying to understand what are the bounds of uncertainty that we need to work with, what are the likely changes that are going to happen to these systems. Another major issue in the plains and prairie potholes is invasive species, and this project is designed to develop decision support tools to help managers in this landscape make good decisions about how to address invasive species issues. And the outcomes here are to provide decision support tools to help managers do that. And this is a case where this is also being piloted on refuges and wetland management districts in this LCC, and then will be extrapolated out beyond the boundaries to other refuge lands. Now moving to the West Coast, to the California Landscape Conservation Cooperative. Clearly this area includes the Central Valley and coastal portions of Central and Southern California, as well as a piece of Mexico, is impacted both by human development and particularly climate change associated with sea level rise. And the first project is one that addresses salt marshes throughout the California LCC and trying to get a better understanding of the impact of sea level rise and trying to assess what are the existing tools that exist in terms of models and data that's available, and to provide value added by adding to that existing information. So this is probably an example of where the refuge holdings of salt marshes in California is probably fairly small, but refuges can play a really key role in pilot areas for this type of project and showing how to adapt and use this information for adaptive management that can help really lead a lot of the other landowners that have salt marshes in this LCC. So the specific outcomes are actually, first of all, getting much more accurate elevation data, which is critical to making decisions at the local scale, monitoring and modeling the annual inundation, and I believe this map shows an annual inundation map, in this case for a state park and the California LCC. And then relating that to the vegetation community and the species using those natural communities. And that hopefully will make it possible for managers to make informed decisions. When should we be restoring? Should we be providing additional land protection? Where are the places where we really need to think about moving away from and making investments elsewhere because of the likely impact on those areas? The second project in the California LCC is more of a monitoring project because one of the critical resources in this LCC is wintering shorebirds. And so one of the recognitions that the LCC came to by working with the joint ventures, and there's a really strong relationship here with the Central Valley and San Francisco Bay joint ventures, is that we don't have a consistent enough wintering shorebird monitoring system. And so this project is intended to actually address that issue and provide consistent monitoring protocols and database management to allow for a better understanding of or ability to track changes to wintering shorebird populations in response to land use changes and climate changes. And so in my mind, this is a great example, I think, of how the inventory and monitoring program of the National Wildlife Refuge System can partner with the LCCs to develop monitoring that applies both on and off refuges and addresses a regional monitoring issue that has come up. And saving the best for the last, the North Atlantic LCC in the northeastern United States and 4 provinces in Canada encompasses 17% of the human population in the US. So clearly human use and human impacts and land use changes are a huge issue in this LCC, but climate change impacts are really quite, going to be quite dramatic as well. So I've grouped a few projects here, and just to let you know that the general theme of the projects that we're working on in the North Atlantic LCC all address this combination of what are the likely impacts from land use changes and climate change as they interact in these landscapes. And we think about that in the broad systems that occur within this North Atlantic LCC that include coastal systems, where we're trying to understand what's the likely impact of sea level rise and increased vulnerability to coastal storms on habitats and species. And specifically, there's a project underway now to look at much more dynamically than has been done before, the impact of sea level rise and beach dynamics, the habitats that are part of that beach, and the relationship of those habitats to the piping plover populations that are utilizing this beach. So this is going to allow us to do two things: hopefully a range-wide assessment of how piping plover are likely to be impacted by sea level rise, but also more locally to understand what management decisions should you make if you're a refuge manager such as Chincoteague or Forsyth, trying to understand how you should manage beaches and plover populations. Secondly, we're supporting a project that's looking at aquatic systems, and particularly in this case, looking at cold water stream systems that support a lot of species of interest, and we're using, in this case, the brook trout as a representative species of those systems, and trying to understand what are the impacts of these already highly fragmented aquatic systems of climate change impacts on stream flow and temperature, and how should we make decisions about removing barriers to fish passage, and also decisions about land use in those watersheds that are informed by these understandings of what's going to happen to the species and habitats in these systems. And finally, we're looking at the complex set of interactions in terrestrial and wetland systems, and I listed 4 different categories there, which are what I hope will be 4 complementary ways that we're going to look at impacts to terrestrial and wetland systems. Sort of our traditional species habitat modeling based approach, but also looking at alternative and hopefully complementary approaches of ecological integrity, and working with our partners, including the Nature Conservancy, on some of their approaches that are looking at the geophysical aspects of those landscapes, as well as regional connectivity patterns. And I'm going to talk in just one more slide about those first 2 categories. The project that we have underway to address species habitat models and ecological integrity is called Designing Sustainable Landscapes for Wildlife, and it involves several steps that include, first of all, developing and compiling spatial data, and in this case that meant in the Northeast region developing a consistent ecological systems habitat classification and map with the Northeast states to allow us to consistently look at habitats across the Northeast region, and working through a process and hosting workshops to select a set of representative species that relate to these consistent habitats across the Northeast. The core part of this project is actually building a landscape change model that incorporates urban growth and climate change and succession, but is being designed to incorporate other major drivers of this system as we go forward, for example, forest management. So based on those 2 things, we can then start to understand what are the likely impacts on habitats from these major drivers, and how does that translate to species, the ability of those habitats to sustain species over time, and also this idea of ecological integrity, which looks at a set of landscape metrics to try to understand what are the likely most resilient habitat patches and systems over time. So one of the things we can then do is actually compare those 2 approaches. And this map that's at the bottom there actually shows an overlay of species habitat models, in this case for a representative species, the wood turtle, and the resiliency maps which show underneath it in the dark blue and green to say where's the intersection of important areas for a representative species and these high ecological integrity, high resiliency areas. So ultimately what this needs to do is translate into a set of priorities that we can use to help prioritize land protection and restoration. And refuges will be a critical part of this process from the very beginning. I hope they will be involved in actually helping to design the science, and most importantly to say, how do we need this science to be translated into tools that's at the right scale and the right format for us to be using it on refuges and in refuge planning to help with this idea of prioritizing land protection and restoration. So just as a transition, I wanted to sum up the common themes of these projects that I presented to you, and those are that Many of them get at this idea that we need to understand and address increasing land use pressures and climate change in the same landscapes. How are those things interacting? And what are the uncertainties associated with them? Every one of the projects I laid out has explicit components of it to address and state all of the uncertainties. And the tools that will come out of these processes are really intended to guide conservation decisions. That's what it's all about. None of these projects are research projects that do not get to this point. They all are specifically designed to get to decision support tools. And particularly, a lot of these projects are going to help with this idea of understanding how much of what conservation actions do we need to do where in order to sustain fish, wildlife, and plant populations. And ultimately, that's really one of the key questions that's being asked in the Refuge vision document. And that's all about doing the right things in the right places. And I hope that this kind of set of tools and projects developed with Refuges, utilizing Refuges information, local knowledge, can support Refuges' needs to strategically move forward as laid out in the vision document. So with that, I'm going to transition to Bridgette.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, so I'm going to kind of take off right where Andrew left off, and we're going to talk a little bit, hone in specifically on Refuges, because really Refuges has already been doing a lot of things on a landscape scale, correct? So the point of talking about projects that are landscape and scale that the LCCs are doing, and then coming in right behind that and immediately talking about, okay, what are Refuges doing that are in landscape and scale, is really a very strategic move by the four of us to do this, in that we really want to have you consider and set you up for this discussion to think about how much crossover exists. There is crossover, and we're seeing a lot of really good examples of it, but we do believe that there can be more. And so I think Andrew recognized this really well, which is that Refuges really can serve as a point of context, in that Refuges are really good at identifying big landscape scale themes. We're a land management agency. We know how to identify things that cross refuge boundaries, that transcend boundaries, that we're all asking, that are going to apply just as equally as well to other land management agencies. And so the examples that come from within the refuge system, even if they don't currently have an LCC component at the moment, are really ideal sources for LCCs to look to for projects that can be expanded to benefit other partners across the landscape. And so probably one of the best examples of how the refuge system looks at a landscape scale is to consider some of their Refuge Cooperative Research Program projects. And these are USGS, National Wildlife Refuge System partnerships, and both bureaus contribute resources and expertise to support each of these projects. And the entire impetus of an RCRP project is to improve science-based management on refuges, either through focused research or adaptive management. These always tend to be very critical management issues that transcend multiple refuges. And the goal is to identify and to resolve longstanding research needs on refuges nationwide. So some of these have sort of slogan names that you maybe have heard of. One of those that's kind of tubbed, the Cattail Project, looks at managing emergent marshes and looks at how a lot of the different ecosystem processes, interactions of prescribed fire, soils, invertebrates, wetland birds, nutrient dynamics, all influence managing emergent marshes. Another study is known often as the impoundment study. And this study has taken place on a very broad landscape scale, primarily in regions 3 and 5, and really looks at the timing of drawdowns on impoundments and what that timing of drawdown has an impact on water birds, invertebrates, vegetation communities within those managed wetlands. And those are all National Wildlife Refuges that are partaking in the impoundment study. There's a reed canary grass project, and that one looks at how to direct the succession of reed canary grass through adaptive management to get those areas to transition into wetland forests or meadows. And this project is similarly large in scale. I know for certain there are refuges participating in regions 3, 5, 6. And so these are places where refuges with common interests on a big scale have identified a common need and worked together to address it. Certainly, we aren't the only other agency struggling with issues like impoundment management or reed canary grass. And finally, unequivocally, the largest of the RCRP projects to date would be the Native Prairie Adaptive Management Project. This project looks to manage native prairies within regions 3 and 6. There are 20 field stations participating and 120 management units that have already signed on to this project, and it is in the second year of implementation. And again, these are projects that offer great points of context for other land management agencies that clearly struggle with similar issues. A very new project, and as I work through these, you're going to see that I'm going to work through from projects that tend to not have a lot of engagement with the LCCs to ones that have more and more engagement. And one of the big factors in that really highlights why a project is maybe more engaged with the LCCs is just that they're newer initiatives. Some of these projects that got started, 5, 6 years ago before LCCs didn't immediately make that segue, where a lot of these newer projects are now immediately partnering with their LCCs as they begin to set up. And so the Invasive Species Project is a new pilot, and that's coming out of the Inventory and Monitoring Program, and it essentially strives to accomplish 3 things. It wants to gain better understanding of the type and scale of invasive species inventory objectives. It wants to evaluate cost-effective methods, and it wants to utilize probability of occurrence modeling to be able to evaluate predicted spread and facilitate management decisions. So the idea is that the information is essentially collected on national wildlife refuges, but that it's going to engage the LCCs in order to help develop national program guidelines for invasive plant inventory and monitoring. And this immediately engaged LCCs from the beginning in that the I&M program directed that the pilot locations for these projects be located in priority LCCs. And so those 4 LCCs that were selected for refuge pilot projects were the South Atlantic, which has the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, the North Atlantic LCC, which has Silvio Conti National Wildlife Refuge, the Great Plains LCC, which has Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, and the California LCC, which has San Diego National Wildlife Refuge. And of course, as I mentioned, the intent is anchor the project within the refuge system, but facilitate discussion and development of project objectives with partners throughout the LCCs. Probably one of the most true examples today that exists of a true partnership between the refuge system and the LCCs, and one that was initiated by the refuge system, would be the Integrated Waterbird Management and Monitoring Project. And this is a very collaborative partnership between federal, state, and NGOs. It's primarily within the Atlantic and Mississippi flyways, and it seeks to answer questions that are very relevant to managers on the ground. Questions like, how does a manager know which species to manage for at a specific site? Or how important is a very single site in the big picture? And then it can scale it up from the local scale and the local question to a regional question and then a flyway question, and be able to equally answer questions such as, how can managers coordinate their management actions across the landscape so that birds have the right kind of habitats at the right time in the right places? And so this is a map of just the national wildlife refuges that are participating as pilot survey sites in the Integrated Waterbird Management and Monitoring Project, but it also has a number of survey sites on state and other public lands. This concept of needing to work with partners in monitoring is really building momentum, and a lot of other projects are kind of playing off the concept of the Integrated Waterbird Management and Monitoring Project. A very new one, actually just in the proposal stages, is a similar thing, just for a different guild of birds, and that is to develop a landscape scale framework for integrating grassland bird conservation and monitoring. Being very new and being initiated by the Refuge system, this one has specifically sought to work with LCCs from the very get-go, and there are a total of 10 LCCs that have the potential to be affected by this project if it gets momentum and becomes another project similar to the Integrated Waterbird Project. So we offer those kind of in that, in the two contexts of what are LCCs doing with their partners that benefits refuges or that directly involves refuges. And then we talk a little bit about what do refuges already do well on a landscape scale. And so we pose this question to you now. You'll see this slide again. We'll re-bring up this issue when we get to the discussion section. And we're going to be asking you, how much crossover do you think currently exists between LCCs and refuges and their initiatives? And can we coordinate better on a landscape scale? And how can we use refuge landscape scale projects as points of context for broader needs with broader partners? And how do we better bring in our other partners into some of these projects? Okay, so we're on to the final section, and this is the section where we'll be bringing you in on the discussion, and we are calling this Identification of Problems, Needs, and Opportunities Facing Refuges and LCCs. Just to give you guys some content to work with, to kind of give you some ideas of what's going on out there. I did some polling. I was trying to kind of get the pulse of the refuge system, talk to people at various levels, and sought their insights and observations on how do refuges and LCCs do a better job of coordinating and collaborating. So how can refuges proactively engage their LCCs? First of all, there's a lot of great conduits for communication that are out there. Clearly, the most obvious one is just to contact directly your LCC coordinator or your LCC science coordinator. They're always available, and they're always picking up the phone and willing to talk to people that want to talk about science needs or want to know more about that LCC and how it operates. But more and more, we're having more opportunities within the service for conduits for communication. A great example of that would exist for the service as a whole would be the new positions, the regional ARDs for science applications. And these are a great point of contact for the refuge system because they're engaging all the Fish and Wildlife Service programs. And so they're able to present to the LCCs priority needs for the service as a whole, as opposed to just the National Wildlife Refuge System. But if we were to step that down to the refuge system, the I&M coordinators and the zone I&M biologists are actually great conduits for communication. A lot of these folks have found themselves onto LCC technical committees and LCC steering committees, and so they're very tied in to the LCCs already. And so they're great points of contact if you want to be talking about issues and getting a hold of your LCCs. We also have very new positions, and you met Rob, he's in the audience. He has, for about 4 weeks now, been the National Refuge System Liaison to LCCs. And Jenny Erickson is also assisting in that capacity. And that is going to be a great avenue for us as well. And they're starting to step this down to the regional level. This is very new. In fact, this information just came in at the end of last week, and there's still a lot of regions that are still in the process of designating who their National Wildlife Refuge System regional liaisons are. The ones that we are currently known are on the screen. If you're in regions 1, 2, 6, or 7, you have those persons designated for you. We know some regions aren't up here, and some of them just currently aren't known because these positions have been assigned maybe in the last week or two. Other than just picking up the phone and knowing who the right people to talk to are, there are other ways to engage LCCs, and a lot of the regions have been using technology as a way to collect input from the field stations. But what I've found is when I talk to the different regions is there isn't really a coordinated way that they're doing it. Each region is kind of picking their own path of how they want to use some form of technology in order to gather input from the field. And so, for example, Region 5 has chosen to use the Fish and Wildlife Service's Information Needs System, otherwise known as the FWINS database. And they have essentially required that if the field level wants to elevate a project need or a project proposal to LCCs, they want it inputted through this FWINS database. But then if you go to Region 6, they've gone ahead and decided to use the SharePoint route and use that to accept projects and proposals. And they've really set up a really nice site, and this was developed by Greg Watson. It includes information on how to submit a proposal. It gives you information on the process that will be used to address needs. And then if you look over on the left-hand side, it's even gotten it sorted out into categories. There's a research needs category, and a management category, and a monitoring category. So it gives you the kind of these just grouped folders for you to be able to put in your ideas within the SharePoint site. And then if you dig down further, say if you go into the research needs folder, it's going to further drill you down and have you use one of the folders for one of the LCCs within this area. What's cool about this is that when this was debuted in Region 6, a lot of the LCC coordinators were on that webinar, and they really liked this tool, and they agreed to use this tool to accept input from the Refuge system on projects. But like a lot of great ideas, it's something that hasn't really caught on and hasn't gotten a lot of momentum, even though it's beautifully built and really well designed. I spent some time looking through it. So far, the only projects that have been loaded up so far are all stuff that Greg Watson has loaded up himself. And so there's always that thing where people are definitely making an effort to try to enhance that coordination communication between refuges and LCCs. What's going to work and what won't is varying by region, and it's varying in how much the field is actually going to use it. This may pick up steam and get used. This is a very new product, so it just remains to be seen how much it gets used. So when I talk to people about refuges and LCCs and how we can effectively interact, bar none, probably the most common thing that I heard was that we just simply don't have the organizational framework yet for effective collaboration. We just don't have an organized system of how is the Fish and Wildlife Service going to organize and communicate with and coordinate with the LCCs. And of course, there's a lot of added complexity for that question when you're working with the National Wildlife Refuge System. For example, how that framework is going to look and what the needs are going to be a lot different if you're talking about the national level, the regional level, or the field level. And so there are some ways to kind of work at this on different levels, and I think there are going to be different avenues for the different levels. For example, at the national level, one of the things that's going on is that the LCCs have formed a council and a network, and they've essentially identified 13 tasks to pursue in step-down working groups, and you can see those listed there. They vary from everything from conservation targets to science needs to marine LCC engagement. These are things that the LCCs have identified that they want to work in more detail towards, and they're just standing up these working groups now. And so what the refuge system has really recognized, that these are all tasks that are relevant to the refuge system itself. And so the refuge system sees the potential for our involvement with these working groups. And one proposal that's out there is that the refuge system place a representative on each of these working groups so that we may be engaged and at the table with the LCCs while they're building their own framework. And that certainly would be a way to help with coordination and communication at that national level. At the field level, a lot of the LCCs are finding that there are people in the field that still are not sure what the LCCs are all about, and they're not sure what the LCCs can do for them. And so some of the LCCs are starting to host workshops for all project leaders of refuges and national fish hatcheries, specifically to meet face-to-face with folks from the field and discuss what the LCCs are all about, and to be able to work directly with project leaders to address their science needs. So we talked a little bit about the added complexity of the levels, but there's also this complexity of the programs. One thing that people are still kind of struggling with is that the Fish and Wildlife Service is actually just one partner of the LCCs. But the programs like to stand alone. And so a lot of the LCC coordinators are finding that they're being approached by the fisheries program and the migratory birds program and the ecological services program. And each of those programs wants their own representative at the table. Each of those programs wants a person on the steering committee or the technical committee. And what we really need to do is try to figure out how all of those programs elevate their priority needs as one voice and one partner to the LCCs. And so there is a group that's trying to work on that as well. There are these structured decision-making workshops. They're often hosted by NCTC. It just so happens that one of these workshops this fall will be an LCC-themed structured decision-making workshop. And one of the proposals that's on the table is to bring together representatives from all the various programs of the Fish and Wildlife Service to work on a specific protocol or framework that would allow the Fish and Wildlife Service to elevate priority needs to the LCCs as a single voice and as a single partner. So there's definitely stuff going on out there. There's definitely ideas flowing. People are coming up with ways to try to work on collaboration. There's a long ways to go, and there's a lot that can be done. We're very interested in your thoughts on how we can improve that. And so to segue into that, I'm going to give you Jeff Rupert, the Chief of the Division of Natural Resources and Conservation Planning, and he is going to act as our facilitator this afternoon. And Jeff?
So we'll make it real quick so that we can spend most of the time hearing from you all. Just real quickly, I'm going to run through these. You guys can please read this. If you sat through the facilitated discussion, we're really going to do some of that kind of thing here. So the idea is we're going to brainstorm for the next 25 minutes, hear from you. We'd rather not get into debates. We'd like to try to avoid that. Concise points, ideas would be very much appreciated. Questions, concerns. And we will capture and sort of include and carry forward everything that we hear. So again, here's kind of the reminder, that idea to hopefully help stimulate some of the discussion, how much crossover currently exists between LCC initiatives and refuge initiatives, refuge system initiatives. Can we coordinate better on a landscape scale? Our research and monitoring needs, or the research and monitoring needs that we hold in common. Okay, so this is just going to stay up, right? That's where we're at here. Okay. Okay, so let's just kind of do that facilitation piece and start with So we're recording these proceedings, so we would like for you to use a microphone so that we get a record of it. So Danielle, you're up.
We actually got
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Susan, you're up.
Speak real quick. One of the things that was crossing my mind, you know, I'm in Region 5, so I put some things in FWINS, and I am a little more inspired now to do it because I did all of a sudden get a call one day about a project that was in there, which was actually kind of, it was no longer updated. It wasn't really a need anymore, but it made me realize they really were looking at it. And then the SharePoint is an interesting idea, but of course, that's only Fish and Wildlife Service accessible, so if we wanted a way for outside partners in other agencies or outside in the LCC group to know what our needs are, that would, I guess, would have to be facilitated directly with our LCC coordinators, but it would be nice if there's a way that that folks could know what our needs are sort of internally. And just as a really brief example, we have some real major wetland management issues at the Refuge where I work, and we just hosted a group of wetland restoration experts from all over, and we have a great cooperative agreement in place, but some really immediate needs were identified, and just we don't have time to do it, and we don't even really have time to go figure out who can. Even there could be some academic interest. The system has got a lot going on right now. It's just begging for research. I feel like, God, there's so much potential here, and I don't have time to go, find people. And I bet if they knew what was going on, there'd be folks that might be interested in really researching the impacts of what's going on sort of before and after upcoming management. So we need help kind of making some of those linkages. So
really just sort of identifying, having a venue, a place to identify a lot of those research needs and find those partners. Yeah, that's outside of Fish and Wildlife. Outside of Fish and Wildlife.
And I'll address that a little bit as I walk here, and that is that I think LCCs have recognized that information management is a critical role for them and in general.
It might be more of a question than a comment. I'm still trying to figure out what the process is of how the LCCs will conduct their work. And so I'm wondering, these needs that are identified, maybe at a refuge complex, we've already got the capacity through partnerships, and one of the things we're lacking is funding to fully support say a research project or a cooperative relationship with, say, a co-op unit. So is there going to be a process where we put in these needs? Does that mean that we can put in for funding through the LCC, or does the LCC, in whatever form it is, grab those projects and implement them?
So, okay, Andrew, do you want to?
Sure, I guess it's good I'm carrying the microphone around. It may be a little different in different LCCs, but all LCCs have a similar organizational structure with a steering committee with high-level managers from all the partners and technical committees. And all LCCs have a process of asking for and consolidating science needs, and then some process of actually selecting among those science needs to either contract work or do a request for proposals to address that work. And that's probably generally going to be an annual process. And I don't know if is that the level of detail you were looking for? Okay.
All right, thanks.
And I'll add on a little bit to that, because that actually happens at 3 levels. We have it within the LCC, where they're developing their science needs that are based upon the needs defined by the partners, and eventually designed to address the conservation targets and the issues that are preventing us from attaining those targets. It happens at a regional level, because we have to work through those climate science centers. Recall, those things are being teed up, and generally there's 2, 3, or 4 LCCs per climate science center. So we have to roll these up in a way that allow the CSC to understand those collective needs. And also there's a national level of needs where we have some funds at the national level to address science needs and other capacity needs of the LCC network as a whole. That could be information management development. It could be partnering with others to address science needs that are system-wide. So the key here is trying to connect all those pieces together. The fundamental piece, though, is what Andrew does and Craig Zarnecki and others at that LCC level, where the real partnership discussions go on to address those initial information needs that are conservation project related.
All right, thanks much. I saw some hands over here. Danielle?
All the way across. Right here.
Let's hit Danielle.
Well, continuing along this conversation of sort of getting into the money and the budgeting things, one of the best way to have partners is to bring money to the table. And of course, LCCs have sort of been, at the startup, been almost a granting group, because we had money for whatever reason, unfulfilled positions or whatnot. I guess what I'm curious about, where do you think LCCs are going to go as far as, are they granting agencies, or that's going to be the huge role? Or how are they going to work the funding aspects about it, of the shared partnership? And how do you get, if it's funding, how do you get other groups to bring money to the table or share resources? Or I'm just a little confused on how the budget things for LCC projects are, the vision for the future past Or is it going to continue along this sort of this just granting exercise, which we've been sort of going through?
Well, and so if you want to briefly address that, and we can talk budget if you guys want to talk budget, but let's also not forget to talk about the research piece and the you know, sort of our shared needs piece as well.
Okay. I guess I will address that, and you're going to have to help me with order here, but and that is that LCCs are not intended to be primarily a grant funding source for research. They are intended to be this partnership that develops shared science capacity. So yes, partners coming to the table need to ultimately bring resources to the table, whether it's in kind or funding or positions. And so part of what the LCC needs to do is articulate the needs that they think it's the most value added that they can provide, and then any of those partners can be involved in helping to decide which set of projects will be selected.
So let's do Andy, and then we'll do Kathy.
Andy Ewan, San Diego National Wildlife Refuge Complex. In terms of the integration of the LCC programs and the Refuge I&M program, we had a success where the LCC program was doing a study with USGS to look at salt marsh across the California coastline. There was a slide that talked about it. At the same time, the inventory and monitoring program was also looking at projects and supported projects on the refuge that complemented the LCC projects that were looking at sea level rise. So the inventory and monitoring helped us establish some permanent baseline measuring stations, some LIDAR sampling that would complement the work that was done by the LCC. So to the extent that an LCC and the IM program and other efforts kind of are all communicating so that they can complement each other, I think would be a great benefit.
Thanks, Andy. Kathy?
Having gone from being a regional office person, and I was the regional climate change coordinator for a couple of years and on the national climate change team, to a project leader in the field, it's been a real interesting transition. And I would say that what we need is three things: communication, communication, communication. I hear nothing at the field level basically anymore versus where I was in other positions. So there's got to be a way that, you know, at the actual refuge that we hear stuff that's going on other than a 2-week window to put in a project proposal or something. You know, there's got to be some way that we hear more about what's going on a continual basis and have input into LCC processes and, you know, gathering information, et cetera.
Excellent. Thank you, Kathy. Rob?
Yeah, Andrew, I was excited to learn about the North Atlantic's efforts to undertake that gap analysis, which would assist refuges in their land protection efforts. I would challenge the LCCs to work with the refuge system to do that type of work nationwide across all the LCCs to assist us in our strategic growth efforts. As you know, it's a big push within the system, and we need to take a landscape scale when considering strategic growth. I think it needs to go beyond just an individual LCC so that we can ensure that we do, in fact, establish a national network at the national scale. Just a challenge.
Thanks, Rob. Let's go back and we'll go over to Ben.
Andrew. Okay, a couple things that we've been doing in Alaska, I think, that helps facilitate refuge involvement in the LCCs. Our LCC steering committees, I think, are a little bit different than some of the other ones where they involve field level folks, and we also have rotating seats for the various refuge field level folks that want to participate in the LCCs. The other thing we're doing is we have a new LCC that's just starting up, the Northwest Interior Forest LCC, and what we're doing with that one, because we have so many refuges, I think it's 9 or 10, involved in that LCC. We're putting together an internal group that will involve all the refuges, and so that we can get that, input from them and take that up through their steering committee members. So those are 2 ideas.
Thanks. Go over to Ben.
So I have sort of a question / suggestion regarding the mechanics of sharing science. That's what LCCs are largely about. We've seen that the refuge system is doing a lot of good science, and that can be shared. And ecological services and fisheries, they all have good science to share, and I'm sure a lot of our partners, Park Service, Forest Service, BLM. And we also noted that each program in Fish and Wildlife Services trying to either get something or share. Trying to develop the mechanics of sharing and communications, have we been talking with our partners, Park Service, BLM? They all have multiple programs, as we do, who are all probably trying to either share or get funding or something like that. Have we been talking to those folks about how they're managing to coordinate their multiple programs and get the information sharing mechanics laid out?
Okay, thanks. So who can best respond to?
I'll address that just for our LCC, and the answer is yes, because they're key partners in our LCC, and we are, one of our highest priorities this year is doing an information needs assessment as a first step to actually developing data and information sharing methodologies. But our starting point is that we need to build off the work that's already been done within the Fish and Wildlife Service and our partner agencies. So yeah, I think we really need to learn from them, and we need to build a system that we can exchange information on science much more easily than we can now. I don't know if you have a national.
Yeah, let me address that from the national perspective, because that is a really major issue for us, and recognizing, particularly with the Forest Service, for example, where a lot of the work they're doing often is related to the challenges that we're facing. And what we've tried to do so far is just initially link up the RFPs that have come out of the LCCs and exchange those with all the Forest Service research stations as well. But what we're trying to move into is a point where we can line these up so that when we develop our needs, we can share them with them, and vice versa, them with us. And then coordinate these research needs across the entities to allow for, identify duplication, identify areas where we can share the same projects with them or exchange information with them. We're doing the same sort of things with some of the NGO partners, for example, TNC, and with even NGOs such as Wildlife Conservation Society, where in their recent call for proposals, we worked with them to identify LCC-related work as part of the fundamental basis for their selection process. So trying to line those up with some of the NGOs as well to do this. But keep in mind that we're all, what, a year and a half down the path in this, even less so from a lot of these, and there's a lot of activity going on out there. So we're trying to chip away at this, but definitely linking these up and aligning the research across these partners is a big part of what we're trying to do at all levels, the LCC level and the national level.
Thanks. Other? Back first. Let's go right here.
Hi, I guess I worked at a smaller refuge, and we were more concerned about how we would actually fit in our LCC, because we were on a way northwest corner of the LCC, and we never really knew how we would be able to fit in with all the other refuges around the very extreme east portion of the LCC. And I guess it's more about like communication, but to also would we be able to compete with different projects that those refuges were more interested in? Do you know what I mean? And how it wouldn't really be relevant to us, even though we're in the same LCC.
So how will priorities be set, and how will projects be selected?
I guess there was several different issues here. One is it shouldn't matter that you're near the border of an LCC, because we really want to try to make these LCCs seamless so that that shouldn't be an issue. I think one of the things is that we have to actually move beyond this idea that there's a competition for funding from the LCC, and to actually think about What is the most important set of things that the LCC needs to address over the next several years, and to actually organize that in a framework so that you can see that framework and you can say, okay, this is what my need actually fits into this set of needs that's been identified, and I should work with the LCC, or if it doesn't, then maybe you're going to need to be another funding source that's going to support your work. So rather than this annual RFP process that's unpredictable, you don't understand what the highest priority is, what we're trying to work towards in the North Atlantic is, with our partners, developing a conservation framework that clearly lays out our priorities for the next several years and how they all fit together and how our partners' work fits into that, so that all the partners can understand what are the highest priorities over the next several years that we should all be working on.
Thanks, Andrew. Jim?
Just wanted to raise a couple of issues that I hear from field staff real frequently relative to, one of the speakers brought up the cooperative research projects done with multiple Fish and Wildlife Service regions and USGS. We've started a number of these projects, the impoundment, the cattail study, the invasive species study. I hear frequently from field staff that we start them, but we don't finish them. We don't publish the results, and we don't share the results. That is a criticism that I hope will not wage with the LCCs and the projects that LCCs start. The other issue that I hear from field staff is organizational structure. LCCs in and of themselves are a new organizational structure, new ARDs, new field staff. How does it relate to refuge I&M coordinators or positions in the field? I think any organizational structure, and those of us that have been around for a while, saw the organizational structure of joint ventures. Keeping it simple and keeping it efficient and effective for the field is our suggestion of what way to go. Don't add complexities to an organizational structure. Keep it simple.
So keep it simple and clarify as we develop sort of what that relationship is between I&M and LCCs.
I agree.
Okay. Let's go to the back. Chris.
My question is, to what extent are the LCCs integrated or involved with our Western Hemisphere international partners and counterparts?
I'll address that for the North Atlantic, which has 4 provinces, and maybe Craig, you can chip in from the upper Midwest, but we are engaging the provinces and federal agencies in Canada as partners in the LCC. Right now they have a single seat on the steering committee by their choice, who is the regional director from the Canadian Wildlife Service, but the provinces are very interested. They're just trying to figure out how they can meaningfully participate given travel and financial constraints. But what we've really come to the conclusion of is that we need to identify specific issues that make sense for us to work together on, such as transmission corridors coming down from Canada, as just an example, and then work together on those issues. I can't address relationships with Mexico, but I know that some of those relationships are being established. Beyond those 2 countries, and I'm not aware of any LCC that's working beyond Mexico and Canada, except maybe indirectly through migratory bird issues.
Cindy, you might want to talk about what we're trying to prepare for next year. If I can put you on the spot.
So we put together a team of folks that are going to be doing a symposium for the first ever Canadian Wildlife Congress annual meeting. My understanding is it's on par with like a Wildlife Society meeting, and Michael may know more about this meeting, but they're looking for abstracts, and we're going to actually be submitting a half-day symposium that will be talking about LCCs and partnering with our Canadian partners, and we're going to be co-organizing it with them. So yeah, exciting stuff.
While we're here, do you want to talk about the Mexico piece real quickly?
Yeah, so in the Desert LCC, for the first steering committee, we were able to get a couple Mexicans from a couple agencies up to that steering committee meeting. They will be one will be part of the science subcommittee, and one will be part of the steering committee. the Bureau of Reclamation, which has the lead for the Desert LCC, is not able to spend any of their money across the border. And so we're looking for some creative ways, working through partnerships, to work with Mexico in the 2 LCCs out of Region 2, the Desert and the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC. And we're working on building relationships right now, and we have a couple high priority issues, such as consistent maps across the countries with consistent models and data to provide a basis. And so there's some priorities that have been identified. How to achieve those goals, we haven't clarified that yet.
You wanted to mention something about the Caribbean.
Bill, are you in? Bill, do you want to talk real briefly about the Caribbean, what we're doing there?
Oh, you can get Patrick
Patrick? And then I think we have time maybe for one more comment or question.
Is Sue Solinsky in here by chance? Where's Sue Solinsky? Have you been involved at all in the Caribbean? I'm just trying to look to see if there's some folks. Okay. All right. So, the Caribbean islands basically was the only U.S. state, territory, province, commonwealth, whatever you want to call it, that wasn't recognized as being on a map. As a matter of fact, you throw the map up there, and where the Caribbean island is Alaska. So it's quite offensive, if you can imagine, to the cultures and the communities down there, to include the infrastructure of the Fish and Wildlife Service. We've got a number of refuges down there. ES Field Station's got a lot of U.S. presence, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service very engaged with the conservation community. So it was fairly, it was tough. It was tough to even go into there and talk to them, but they're very much interested. They basically pulled themselves together in a community and said, we want to be part of this. We need to figure this out. And they also recognized that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and why I was looking to Patrick there for a minute and he quickly bailed on me, was the international role of working through the Caribbean islands. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has some international capacity or ability to work across the international borders, but it seems like it's a little more clumsy than the Forest Service. And so the Forest Service has stepped up and said, hey, we're going to help lead this at both the local level as well as the national level. So they pulled together somewhat of an interim steering committee. The Forest Service has identified a lead contact. Fish and Wildlife Service, it's really happening at the field level more so than any other. And of course, it's a much smaller geography, so it makes a little more. It's a little easier to get that moving at that level. But anyway, so they're pulling together a key group of individuals: USGS, the Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth, Fish and Wildlife Service, to include the Ecological Services Program, are investing in. Even though it's not being funded individually, it's recognized that all the other agencies and organizations are already moving in this direction. How do we better collaborate and co-invest in this? So they're all moving resources together to move towards helping to understand the impacts of climate change, et cetera, on the Caribbean islands, and how they're going to work collaboratively in that direction.
Okay, thanks, Bill. All right. If somebody has a short comment or something that they really want to get captured, we can do that. Otherwise, we need to wrap up. So, going once.
I'm going to just throw a really quick question out there, which is in response to Kathy's, which I completely agree with. Communications is not what it needs to be. And I think all LCCs are working on increasing their capacity for web-based communications, webinars, electronic newsletters. But ultimately, of course, involvement by engagement in actual work is where the real communications are going to happen. But the really quick question I had for you, besides those things I just mentioned, how do you want to hear from LCCs? What do you Kathy, what would be your preferred? Any of those? Okay. I mean, those things are coming. If they haven't happened in your region already, I'd be very surprised if they're not coming. It's a capacity issue right now, but it's happening. Okay. And I'm sorry to.
No, that's okay.
That's all right.
Yeah.
One of the emphasis on starting an LCC is to get other agencies and organizations included and engaged in the process of building the LCC and not make it fish and wildlife centric, which makes sense. But in the process of doing that, we discouraged refuge managers from attending LCC workshops because we didn't want to have too much of a fish and wildlife presence. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of refuge managers are not engaged and really up to speed on what's happening.
Okay. And hopefully the tone of some of that has changed. Okay, I apologize. We're going to have to wrap it up so that Bridgette gets a chance to wrap up. And thanks, everybody.
Thanks. I'm going to take a minute of your time, and that's all. We just wanted to be able to kind of bookend this thing and leave you with some take-home messages. Thank you for your comments. We'll take those that apply to our questions and try to carry those forward. We're really pleased to see the interest in the topic today. We just wanted to leave you with just the notion that LCCs are really very much so still a work in progress, and the entire network is really not fully functional at this time. They're not going to look all the same because, as you saw from Doug's presentation, they're managed in different ways. But they do hope in time to have that consistency built into the network so that they are seamless and efficient. Their boundaries are certainly intended to be fluid and porous. And the partnership members are going to be setting the direction for each LCC individually, and the network of LCCs as a whole will be able to incorporate these differences into the operations of the networks. And so those unique circumstances of each LCC will be embraced and accommodated. And of course, there are great uncertainty with climate change in the 21st century, but with the LCCs, there really is great opportunity for us here in this room and others to be able to build the LCC network from the ground up. And finally, a really important point that Rick Nelson made and that he really wanted to carry forward was just that LCCs aren't intended to come to the refuge system and say, we're going to tell you how to do things. We're going to fix everything. We know how to make things better. They already recognize that the refuge system is very good at doing science and has good science, and that LCCs are here to add value to that. And so we leave you with those thoughts, and thank you for your participation today.